Turn it over, though, to a brief welcome from Venerable Carol Karate, who's at Seychin Ling Center for Tibetan Buddhist Studies Director. So I'll turn it over to her, and then we'll introduce today's topic and, of course, our illustrious presenter.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. And Geshe-la, thank you so much for coming. We were very fortunate to host Dr. Jinpa last year in person at Seychin Ling, back in the days when that was possible. But we're very honored that Geshe-la has agreed to join us today. And this is going to be an amazing talk on Lama Tsongkhapa. So I won't go into details here, except that as we were leading up to the event, there was a lot of discussion about the wonderful book that came out last year by Geshe-la, Tsongkhapa, A Buddha in the Land of Snow. So check that out if you haven't. And thank you, Jinpa-la. Thank you, please.
Okay, yes. So we're as Venerable Carol mentioned, we are very, very happy to have Thupten Jinpa with us. For those of you who may not know, last year we did host him, and it was an auspicious occasion as it was the 600th anniversary of the parinirvana of Tsongkhapa Losang Drakpa. And he, Jinpa, had done us all a great service by writing this amazing modern biography, which I would love to know if this is maybe the first modern biography written under these circumstances of a major Tibetan Buddhist historical figure on Lama Tsongkhapa. So this was released, and we wanted to kind of continue the discussion if we can stay in the zone of Tsongkhapa's thought. And so at Jinpa's suggestion, he said it would be good to perhaps talk about these visions that Tsongkhapa had in the Wölkha Valley in Tibet, and as they pertain to his tenacity and his rigorous pursuit of his understanding of the view of reality according to Buddhism. So with that, we just will get right into this. And thank you very much, Thupten Jinpa, for being here. We are very, very glad to have you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So at the beginning, I would like to invite all of us to just, take a quiet moment and just collect our thoughts so that we could find that a bit more settled state of mind. Just, if you need your breath, focusing on your breathing as an anchor, please do so. But otherwise, just find that quiet space in your mind. Just feel that energy. And then connect with our aspiration to get to know Tsongkhapa and his teaching and his realization a bit more deeply and intimately, so that they become real in our own personal life and spiritual path. Thank you. So once again, it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to say a few words on Tsongkhapa. And I would like to thank Seychin Ling, Venerable Carol, and Stephen for really insisting that I do this again. Those of you who have been trying to get me to do something, I can be a little elusive on the email because I don't touch emails during the weekends, and after 5:30, I just don't touch anything. So sometimes people get a little worried. I say yes, and then the total silence, and next thing you know. So you've been very patient, so thank you for that. And as Venerable Carol and Stephen pointed out, that I had the pleasure to actually speak for the first time publicly about this modern biography I was working on at Seychin Ling last summer, 2019. For me, that experience was quite powerful because it was for the first time. Although I have spoken about the experience of writing quite passionately and animatedly with my family members, my colleagues, and everybody, but I haven't had the chance to do that publicly. So that was a really good experience. And then It was followed by a similar talk I gave in London at Jamyang Center, which is a sister organization of the Jeling in the FBMT family. Again, that was very, very moving. So, and then of course the culmination of all of this was the 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's parinirvana, which was really internationally celebrated and commemorated in Ganden, officiated by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And for me personally, it was very deeply moving experience, having been a monk for a long time, to see in one place all the senior leadership of the Gelug tradition. In addition to His Holiness Ganden Rinpoche, the two churches, all the heads of the monasteries, and many of the senior lamas who have been teaching internationally, including Lama Zopa. So to see all of them in one place, united by our deep admiration of Tsongkhapa and sense of gratitude to him. And it was also a beautiful occasion because we had that international conference, which I was personally involved in, bringing many of the senior Western scholars who have devoted, 40, 50 years of their life to studying Tsongkhapa and Tsongkhapa's tradition, to really making, so the senior, I call them in the Tibetan tradition, we talk of Laba Gemba, the senior colleagues. So those who know the monastic tradition, in monastery, the hierarchy matters, and a large part of the hierarchy is a matter of seniority in your age. When did you become fully ordained? So your ordination date determines your seniority. So I refer to Professor Jeffrey Hawkins and Professor Thurman, Bob Thurman, as the two senior most Laba Gembas in the scholarly world of the Gelug tradition. So I personally made sure that all of them were invited, and they were Donna Lopez was there, Guy Newland was there, Betsy Nepper was there, Venerable Annie Thupten Jinpa was there. So I basically told them that this is going to be a big party. I said, His Holiness is getting older. We're all getting older. We may never have this kind of opportunity in our lifetime. So it's a way of also showing and gratitude to His Holiness as well, so that he, as he gets older, if he's able to see all the students who have been with him for 40, 50 years, steadfast in their commitment, in their work, in their devotion to him, it's a kind of, as the Tibetan Buddhists would say, it's an offering of practice to our Guru as well. So I said, get yourself up to India, to Hubli, which is the nearest, or Bangalore, or Hubli. Then from there, I said, I'll take care of it. Your accommodations, your food, taxis, I said, I'll be the travel agent. So anyway, it really was a deeply, deeply moving experience. And His Holiness was also very deeply touched. I was fortunate to have my own book on Tsongkhapa's biography released officially by His Holiness. And also we had the entire collected works of Tsongkhapa and Gyaltsab and Khedrup, which has been critically edited, and the work took many years. And I was fortunate enough to be able to raise the funds to pay for the two senior editors who are full-time dedicated to this work for over 10 years. So 44 volumes of the critical edition of the three collected works, the three masters, became available. And this is now in searchable Unicode e-text. So I have it on my iPad. Now I can search by typing in the keywords, any volume for whatever I'm looking for. It's just miracle. I mean, it's like in the old days, lamas and gishis, they have to spend so much time cultivating familiarity with each text. And even then, I remember my own teacher, Rinpoche, a lot of the techniques of reading text I learned from him. And one thing that I learned from him, which actually now almost all the young students and scholars copy, adopt, is we would highlight all the outlines. And then the next time when the outline says that number 2 has 3, you don't know which number 2 it is. So I would go back to the earlier reference and write the page number and the line number so that we know which two we are talking about. And this is a way of making these texts sort of more accessible. But now in the modern format, it's very easy because it's all searchable. And also in my own edited works of classical text, we insert the title of the section itself so that it's in a smaller font so that it's easier. But anyway, now I'm diverting. But the point is that it was a big coming together. And for me, someone who has spent a lot of my own professional work working on Tsongkhapa, to be able to see all of these come together was a truly inspiring and moving experience. I was there for just over a week. I came in and zoomed out because it was around the Christmas time. I left on the 23rd, 22nd from Ganden night after a major event, right after the event, and then took the plane from Bangalore 23rd night and got to Montreal on 24th in time for the Christmas Eve, which is important for my family, my wife's family, which is French Canadian. For them, Christmas Eve is an important, so that I could juggle both worlds. But for me, during those 6-7 days I was there, it was like a dream. And I'm sure it was like that for many people. So I wanted to thank Tsechen Ling for, starting that cycle. For me, that was the thing that started and culminating in Ganden. But when I was at Tsechen Ling last summer, who would have thought that the world was going to change in such a way? With all our, we have great minds in the world, we have great yogis in the world, we have great highly realized beings. Not a single person could have predicted where we are right now. How? And if nothing else, this pandemic experience brought home powerfully the veracity of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism: impermanence, no self, importance of letting go, bringing priorities in our life, not wasting your precious human existence of, leisure and opportunity, and, sort of valuing your important relationships in your life. So it has really, for me, this pandemic has really brought home powerfully the truth of the fundamental, perennial, spiritual values. So, I think it's important for us Buddhists, as we, get more specific in our own personal practice, with a specific sadhana, with a specific lineage, with a specific prayer, not to forget that broader human spiritual experience, and not to forget our shared common human experience. So I think it's important. So for this particular session, I was going to focus a bit more on Tsongkhapa's experience of the vision of Manjushri, and particularly choose to this very short text. It's an 18-line instruction which Tsongkhapa received directly from Manjushri and which was memorialized by him, including providing a short summary of the structure of that short text. This happened actually in 1393, before he was 40 years old, so towards the end of his Wölkha Valley 3-year retreat period. One of the interesting things about Tsongkhapa's life is that until he established Ganden monastery, most of the time he was in one retreat or hermitage. So you can see that from the colophons of the text that he was working on, as well as many of the letters that he has written to his students. So you can see in the colophon where he was, and most of the time he was in different retreats or hermitages. Now his favorite hermitage really was in the Wölkha Valley area. So there are a couple of hermitages there. So this is the Wölkha Valley in the southern part of Tibet, southeastern part of Tibet. And Tsongkhapa really spent 3 years in intensive retreat, but also after that, he came back to Wölkha Valley for another 1-year retreat. So he kept repeating visiting it. So Wölkha Cholung is the main retreat that was specifically built for him. But before that, he was in Wölkha Samdaling, and there are many other Jingchi. So this is the area where he spent those 3 years. But one thing is that he never really liked staying in one place for too long. And this, those who are familiar with the Vajrayogini practice, there's a beautiful line in one of the lineage guru prayers where the author talks about so through single pointed meditation in indeterminate places. So that was really Tsongkhapa. He didn't want to get fixated on any particular place. So moving around was important for him. So he moved around within that valley. So one of those sites was, in the larger Wölkha Valley area, but it's more in the Tapo direction. It's called Yasopo, Tapo Menlung. It's a medicinal, herbs area. There, he experienced a number of powerful visions of Manjushri. Before, when he was communicating with Manjushri, it was more indirect. First, he was communicating to Manjushri through Lama Umapa Baodoji, for whom he has written a beautiful kind of praise. And then later, one of his senior students, Thupten Jinpa, who was in fact a year older than Tsongkhapa, who was also someone from Amdo. And Thupten Jinpa was also served as a medium. And it was only towards later that Tsongkhapa himself began to experience direct vision of Manjushri. And even then, the personality of the Manjushri that would appear to Thupten Jinpa versus Tsongkhapa seemed to be quite different. But Tsongkhapa, Manjushri was a bit more formal, serious, but always to the point. Whereas to Thupten Jinpa, it seems the vision he was experiencing Manjushri had a character that was a bit more informal, chatty, kind of, friendly. I don't know why that is the case. Probably it reflects the temperament of the person, individual, Lama himself. Because Tsongkhapa, one thing that we know from, what we know about his life, that he was always a very focused man. He was very focused. He did not have much time for chit chats. He was very polite, very gentle, very kind, but he was always very focused. So probably the character of the Manjushri that was revealed in vision probably reflects that temperament of the individual. But this Yasopu is one area where Tsongkhapa had this very powerful vision of Manjushri. And according to the biography, that vision occurred when he was not alone, when he was with his immediate, hermit, students with him. And so the vision took the form of a sword coming out of Manjushri's heart and touching his heart. And at the tip of this sword was, streams of nectar and light rays flowing into his heart. And interestingly, some of the students around him also felt that power, as if the biography says that they could taste the nectar, they could feel the light touching them. So that was a very powerful experience Tsongkhapa had at Yasopo. And immediately after that experience, he wrote a 4-line, very cryptic line, and this is here in the city of Katara, attracted by flowers of, now I can't see the flowers of its garden, swarms of honeybees frolic about, busily sucking the honey. So it's very cryptic, and Katara seem to be the first syllables of 3 different words, but basically it's referring to Tsongkhapa's kind of body. So essentially what this was saying is that Tsongkhapa's body received this surge of nectar coming from Manjushri's heart. And that was written And now it was at that time in Gyaltsokpo, the 18-line instruction was received. And this 18-line instruction is actually very beautiful. I have only received the oral transmission of this, loom, from my own teacher, Rinpoche, because I received the loom, the oral transmission of the entire the entire collected works of Gyaltsab and Kirtrup and Jey Tsongkhapa when I was at Ganden. So it was more than a month-long teaching session, but I received the entire oral tradition. So this is part of that. I know in the later Gelug tradition, there isn't, surprisingly, any specific commentarial transmission on this text, which is a little surprising given the historical importance of this text, and particularly the source of this text, which is believed to be none other than Manjushri himself. There is a commentary written by the 18th century meditator, great master, Pujo Ngawan Champa, who was one of the most important meditators of the 18th century in the Gelug tradition. He was a contemporary of Yongzi Yishe Gyaltsen, Benjen Pandey Yishe, and he had many disciples, including Yongzi Yishe Gyaltsen himself. So Pujo Ngawan Champa wrote a short commentary on this, but Tsongkhapa himself wrote a short summary on the text. Now, what makes this text unique is that in 18 lines, the entirety of the Vajrayana Buddhist path to enlightenment is actually condensed. So that's what makes it, and it's also from a very practice perspective. So what I would like to do is now to sort of go through these 18 lines very briefly, and then I can comment on the broader issues that come up from these 18 lines. So, so the first 3 lines really is kind of a summary of the most important aspects of the path. So without abiding anywhere, contemplate your mind as space-like. Strive in all complementary practices. So you can see the first 2 lines related to the wisdom aspect of the path, and here particularly focused on realization of the emptiness of one's own mind. Because mind is, both in Sutra and Tantra, the source of both samsara and nirvana. And mind is the source from which all the afflictions arise, but also the door to liberation starts from there. So no wonder in the Gelug tradition, if you think of the sutra practice, a large emphasis is placed on understanding the nature of mind. And for example, in the Gelug Mahamudra practice, Gelug Mahamudra is nothing other than meditation on emptiness of one's own mind, essentially. And 2 levels are identified. One is the conventional nature of the mind, which is focused more on the shamatha practice. And the ultimate nature of the mind is the vipassana, insight section of the Gelug Mahamudra practice. And then an advanced level of Vajrayana, then the practice of the clarity or clear light or luminosity of the mind is, arises from the mind isolation. So mind, as we know, and then we know in the Dzogchen and the Mahamudra, Kagyu, in all of these, understanding the nature of the mind is central to Mahayana, path to enlightenment. So the strive in all complementary practices really kind of refer to the method aspect of the path. So you can see that in this, the 2 elements of the path to Mahayana path to enlightenment are actually presented in a very brief summary format. And then the 3rd line is, the method aspect of the path, complementary practices. So this is basically all the other aspects of the path. So this, in a way, it's a summary. And then the next 4 lines is really talking about the conditions that we need to create for a serious practice. Essentially, cultivating the stability, the foundation of morality, and then training our mindfulness and meta-awareness to be able to cultivate this settled state of mind. And so in other words, is really talking about the other mental conditions that are necessary to really get deeper into the practice. So those are more like kind of factors necessary for the successful practice. So it's free to remaining alone like a rhinoceros. It's talking about the importance of having focused attention, discard all distractions. Here you're talking about the concentration practice, and abiding with an equipoise. So that's a meditative sitting session. Formal sitting is also important. Approach the Great Awakening. So those are conditions that we need to create. You just can't barge in. So, I mean, we can if we have a good control over our mind, but not many of us do. And mind has its own energy, its own will. Although we feel like we have control over our mind, but actually in reality, not that much. Especially if we want to go delve deeper, without some degree of settledness, mental state stabilization, it's very difficult to get any, headway. So those are the important conditions. And then from the next verse onwards, now the path of the wisdom and method are being now explained in a more elaborate way, starting with the method aspect of the path. So here you can, those who are familiar with Tsongkhapa's teachings will know the three principal elements of the path are popping up, or the three, teachings of the three scopes. So the fruition of karma is never in doubt. So it's referring to the initial scope practice. Basically, the initial stage, your emphasis should be really on living a moral life on a day-to-day basis, refraining from the 10 negative actions, and promoting virtuous activities. And there, the central, outlook that you need is a deeply felt conviction in the law of karma, which is the precept of having taken the refuge. Cultivated renunciations, that's the middle length, middle scope practice, where based on reflecting deeply on the suffering of cyclic existence, and you cultivate a deeply felt sense of disenchantment for cyclic existence, and then develop a genuine aspiration to attain freedom. So that's renunciation. And then bodhicitta is the intention that is necessary for the, entering the higher capacity. So you can see that these are the, the key Lamrim teachings, really summarized in a very succinct way. The next two lines are a bit more esoteric because they relate to Vajrayana method aspects of the practice. So keeping ablaze the great fire of mindfulness, the fuel of 6 objects will definitely be consumed or burned. So here, Tsongkhapa is talking more about the uncommon aspects of the uncommon method. And particularly, those who are familiar with Tsongkhapa's teachings, you will remember that for Tsongkhapa, in advanced Vajrayana practice, when it comes to emptiness, there is nothing new level to discover. Emptiness is the same in Sutra and in Tantra. Where Vajrayana, particularly advanced Vajrayana practice, really shows its uniqueness and distinctiveness is the method aspect of the path, particularly the concentration practices. So here he's talking about, those advanced Vajrayana practice, which really allow us to relate to our objects of senses in a very unique way. So the idea here is, cultivating blissful states of mind, and then recognizing all the objects that we interact with as manifestations of our bliss mind. And in this way, in some sense, your relationship with the objects become non-dual. So there is no subject-object duality. There's no grasping, because the grasping only happens when there is a kind of a from subject to object, kind of attraction. So this is referring to advanced Vajrayana, method aspect of the path. Now, from here onwards, then the wisdom aspect of the path is being explained a bit more in detail by choosing first the object, then the subject, then the union of the object and subject. And this being an oral teaching, you can see the kind of slightly opaque, kind of a mystical kind of tone of the language. So it says no phenomena of either samsara and nirvana ever were or nor will be perceived. So this is making a general statement of emptiness. So basically, there's nothing that exists intrinsically, either now or in the past or in the future. So nothing will ever be perceived, nor has been perceived. Like space, they transcend all boundaries. So essentially, so this is important because right at the beginning, Tsongkhapa used the imagery of space to describe the mind. Here too, he's using the imagery of space. And so this imagery of space is a crucial instruction kind of, aid when the teaching is on emptiness. Because space, you cannot really speak in terms of boundaries. You can only understand it. Now, this space is defined in the Buddhist sense of absence of obstruction. So space can only be understood in terms of a negation, absence of something, and also a vastness of it, and the uniformity, oneness. So that's why space is a very important imagery in Tsongkhapa's writing, but also in Buddha's Mahayana Sutras. There's a beautiful passage which is cited in Chandrakirti's text, where the sutra says that the Bodhisattva's wisdom cruises the space of emptiness, but no traces can be found of where the mind is cruising. Just as in this massive sky, although the birds fly and cruise, but you cannot say here is a trace of a bird where birds flew. So I think this imagery of space is really crucial. So the reason why Tsongkhapa is choosing to move from object to subject to the union is actually very important, because initially a large part of our clinging and grasping really is from here to there. There's a kind of a movement. And that's because, and this is one area where it's really helpful to look at the psychological dimension of the teaching on emptiness. This is one area where Tsongkhapa's innovation is really, really crucial. Yes, emptiness is about ultimate nature of reality. So in some sense, we're talking about an objective fact of reality, the fact that nothing exists in an independent way. So that's a very important point. It's about truth in this broad sense. But for Tsongkhapa, what is also more important is to really understand the psychological dimension of the emptiness teaching, which is to say that how, when we look deeper into our psychology, we find that a large part of our reaction and engagement with the world is underpinned by a certain mechanism, which is, which we may bring into our experience, but most of the time we are not that conscious of. It's almost like a kind of a natural reaction. And so here in Tsongkhapa's Madhyamaka writing, he also brings the psychology of the afflictions, how something like attachment, how something like anger arises, and what kind of mechanism underpins it, and what continues to strengthen it, and what can undermine it. And here, I think essentially what Tsongkhapa is doing is really following the Buddha's basic insight that if you really want to get rid of something, you need to first understand the causal dynamics of that phenomenon. Without understanding the causes and the conditions, you wouldn't know even where to start. So with respect to grasping at inherent existence as well, we need to have some understanding of the psychology of that mechanism, you know. And here, Tsongkhapa basically is saying that, you know, our perception of the world is really defined by our experience of the world. And our experience of the world, for human beings at least, it's inescapably, you know, tied to the language structure. You know, our language is composed of nouns and adjectives, and, you know, so we feel as if nouns reflect the thing and the adjectives reflect the properties of those things. And you know, we have this idea, and the nouns and adjectives kind of, you know, the perception of the world mirroring things and attributes and properties. And in some ways, a contemporary evolutionary psychologist would say that actually, without that, you won't be able to survive. And they may be true. We have to assume that if I lift my leg up, next time I put it down, the earth is going to be there that I can trust. And, you know, without those kind of basic trust, we as human beings won't be able to function. Tsongkhapa will accept that point, but Tsongkhapa will say that actually we are bringing a lot more as a basis of that trust. And so what he's suggesting is that we can continue to have function in the world in a robust, effective way. That's why he calls conventional reality. Yet not move on to the next level, which is the layer of objective intrinsic existence that we expect to be there, which we attribute. Because this is what leads to all kind of grasping, clinging, and so on and so forth. So what the teaching on emptiness for Tsongkhapa is not simply about finding the objective truth of reality. It's also about a teaching on getting rid of our grasping. So moving from tackling the object is the first step, because objects are more obvious, evident. Our relationship with them are more easily analyzed. You know, although we know that we start from grasping at ourselves first, which is a very fundamental, you know, as Chandrakirti puts, you know, first the thought I am arises, and then the thought mine arises, and then we build up a whole edifice of emotional life. So he's right. So the initial, you know, impulse really comes from within, but immediately we project it out, and the relationship is really about. And there, I think, you know, if we are serious about this, I think jumping right into emptiness is not the way to go. The first layer has to be really tackled by taking deeply the teaching on impermanence. You know, just taking to heart, you know, if you look at the impermanence, and impermanence not just in very conventional, normal sense of, yes, it's going to break, it's going to go away, whatever comes, you know, dies, or whoever gets, you know, whoever's born at some point will die. Those are very, yes, kind of, you know, basic ideas about impermanence, but no, but impermanence in the Buddhist sense is really the understanding that actually, you know, everything is changing moment by moment. You know, our sense of recognition, in fact, the recognition presupposes a continuity of a thing. So already, even at the basic level of identity, attribution of identity and recognition, we are already adding things onto reality. Just being able to tackle that alone can really help, you know, chip away at this grasping, because emptiness, it's very difficult to just plunge in, because what is being asked is very, very radical. I mean, in fact, there's a, you know, no wonder the story is that when Tsongkhapa first had the bolt of lightning, you know, actually it was not Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa was giving a teaching, and one of his senior students, Chizun Sherab Singye, you know, had a bolt of lightning, and he was so afraid. His instinct was to grab his shirt, you know, because the no self teaching was so radical. He just had to make sure that he was there. so the real teaching on emptiness is very radical, but That's why I think we need to take seriously. We should not dismiss teachings on impermanence as not being Mahayana teaching. It's just kindergarten level. No, it's actually quite radical itself. So by working on the level of impermanence, then gradually moving on to absence of independence, and then finally addressing the way in which we attribute intrinsic existence to things, then we can, begin to see change. So the object is really the first one. Then the second is the subject. Now, grasping to intrinsic existence subject is a bit more subtle. Here we are talking about our own experience, and here sense of self as well. And so it may not be that obvious to us, and it may be harder to bring to mind, because even without thinking about intrinsic existence, when we do meditation on the nature of mind, it is challenging, because there's, with at least with material object, you can imagine it, because there's a spatial location, there's a shape, there's a color, but when you think of mind as an object, there's hardly anything to grasp at. So the grasping at mind is subtler. So that's why he's taking that second. Now, as you deepen, once you have managed to do some deconstruction in relation to object, then to mind, then our mind may shift to thinking that, yes, maybe there is something, a higher truth, which is somehow a union of object and mind, object and subject. So again, Tsongkhapa is saying, no, here too, you cannot grasp. So this is essentially similar to the Buddha's teaching on emptiness of emptiness. Because the interesting thing about the human mind is that as we delve deeper into discovering truth, when we negate one level, we find something, our mind's tendency would be immediately to latch onto that thing that we found and reify it. That's one of the reasons why in Buddhism, there's this emphasis on radical relativity, no absolute. Because the moment you attribute some absolute property to something, the mind will immediately reify it. And that's one of the reasons, that's a fundamental insight in Buddhism in general. That's one of the reasons why Buddhism refuses to even acknowledge the idea of absolute God. And same thing with self. So the idea is that the moment you attribute some positive characterization to ultimate truth, the mind will find a way to grasp. And this is the reason why in Nagarjuna's writings, in Tsongkhapa's writing, in Chantakirti's writing, they refuse to come up with any positive characterization, attributes of emptiness. The ultimate truth is always defined in negative terms. The closest they come to ever using affirmative language is thatness, suchness. But that's an empty word. Thatness doesn't give you anything to hang on to. Suchness doesn't give you anything, basically. So I think, and this is something that is really crucial for those of us who want to take emptiness seriously. So, and then he says that by moving from object to subject, and then finally negating the union of the two, then one will be able to really find the path that is praised by all the Buddhas. So, and here, with respect to actual practice, one thing that we have to remember in Tsongkhapa's teaching is that there's a huge emphasis on cultivating deeper intellectual understanding first. Not only in relation to emptiness, but in relation to the overall path. And that's one of the hallmark of Tsongkhapa's approach. Even though you may be practicing a very specific instruction, like say a sadhana or Vajrayogini, your practice is very specific, but that specific practice needs to be based upon a bedrock of a solid understanding of the overall map of the Buddhist path, the big picture view. That is really important for Tsongkhapa, so that you know what, you know the significance of the specific practice that you're doing so that it doesn't become siloed. So this is a very important point, and particularly when it comes to emptiness. In actual meditation, often, particularly the tantric type, presupposes that you have a deeper understanding of emptiness, so that in moments of the visualization, you are asked to recall that understanding. But if you haven't developed that understanding, how can you recall it? So in Tsongkhapa's language, the key term here is ascertainment, ngeba. And in fact, Tsongkhapa's understanding of the mechanism behind a genuine spiritual transformation is all about this ngeba, ascertainment. There's a beautiful passage in Lamrim Chenmo where he says that the extent and the depth of transformation you will experience is a function of how forceful your ascertainment is, how long you are able to sustain it, how clear that actual ascertainment is, and how stable that ascertainment is. So he's talking about a strength of that ascertainment, clarity, enduring, temporal, it's not just once or twice, it's something that you should be able to sustain over a prolonged period of time, and then a stability in a firm way. So it's not like our monkey mind, just popping in and out, just getting distracted and then popping back. It has to be a sustained, stable, with a clear awareness of emptiness. And there, ascertainment becomes key. And so if you, the most practical instruction on meditation on emptiness in the Gelug tradition are referred to as Tati, Guide to the View. Guide to the View texts are quite short. But the Guide to the View text presupposes that you have done the hard work first. And that hard work really needs to be done by studying Lamrim Chenmo, the final section, and Tsongkhapa's, Umagongpa, illuminating the intent. By the way, it's going to come out next spring. My own translation just happened at the press, and it's going to come out. So, and then when you are studying these texts, there are instructions. He says every now and then, make sure that you relate that to your own experience, to your own perspectives on the world. He says it should not be as if you are talking about emptiness out there. And so the distance between your understanding of emptiness and your own experience should not be a big one. So he says otherwise you will be meditating on emptiness in an objective way, a subject-object duality. So he says that you should feel as if your mind is immersed in it. So I think those are really important, but in the actual instruction, a huge effort, at least in Tsongkhapa's understanding, needs to be made on recognizing the way in which intrinsic existence appears to our natural thought I am. And he distinguishes between the appearance and the apprehension dimension. Sometimes in the teachings, you feel as if the emphasis is really on understanding the apprehension. But in Tsongkhapa's own writing, he is clear. Much of the emphasis should really be on trying to understand how intrinsic existence appears. It's really on the perception. And so Nangwa, and there it requires a fair bit of, not so much shamatha completely, but fair bit of mental stability, because you are expected to get to enough settled state of mind where you can conjure, through a kind of a thought experiment, a moment when your sense of self could be more pronounced. And then from a corner of your mind, you're supposed to observe it. So what we are talking about here is a very highly developed ability to apply meta-awareness. That meta-awareness can only be cultivated if we have done some shamatha practice. Because we are asked to, in some sense, split our mind and have from a part of that mind acting as a kind of a meta observing without disturbing the overall mind state, which is focused on observing how the eye appears to the mind. It's easier said than done. It's actually quite challenging. But on the other hand, at least you can get a sense what he's asking us to do. And that kind of practice really requires an ability to calm your mind, to be in a settled state, to create that spaciousness, and then simply observe. And once you observe and you become, and then he has this whole discussion about how the self might appear to our mind. And it's quite complex. I don't want to go into the details, but what he's saying is that although sense of self arises in us naturally, most of the time we take it for granted that we don't pay attention to how it actually arises. So what he's asking is to create a scenario where we can deliberately evoke the arising of that natural sense of self and then create enough space in that mind to be able to observe it. So those are things that needs a little bit of practice. So, and then when you do this, the more you are able to recognize how the mind is attributing, intrinsic existence to our own self, the more you will be able to understand that it's not part of the reality. So in this way, he's asking us to develop a deep, almost experience-based, not an experiential in the direct sense, but experience-based appreciation of how we attribute intrinsic existence to self and our mind. And then in meditation, he really wants us to maintain a fine balance between a more discursive approach, which would take up a topic like, a subject like ourself, and then deconstruct it. And then when we get to a point where we are convinced that nothing like what we assume to exist is really there, then he wants us to rest there, not just move on. So this is the combination of analytic, discursive, and resting is really key to Tsongkhapa. Now, in some Tibetan masters' traditions, teachings, they really emphasize the resting part. But Tsongkhapa really wants to emphasize that you need, and then in fact, there is a beautiful set of oral teachings by Tsongkhapa in his collected writings, which were compiled together by Keduje. And some of them are very esoteric, advanced, so generally they are not translated and available. But they are really, there's a beautiful collection of those two different collections. And in one of those texts, there is a very short instruction by Tsongkhapa called the Vajra lines on the view. And there Tsongkhapa talks about 5 different ways of meditating on emptiness. And what is relevant for us, at least I'm speaking from my personal perspective, being on the beginner, is the first 2. The first one is really how to meditate on emptiness on the beginner stage. And then the second one is a little bit more advanced, where you are beginning to have some stability of shamatha type. Not complete shamatha, but similitude of shamatha, where you are able to bring your mind to a settled state. So in those 2, in the first one, Tsongkhapa says that at the beginner stage, the overwhelming emphasis should be really on the discursive approach, and emphasizing as much as possible, try to make sense of this non-implicative negation, the simple negation. You should be able to, through a deconstructive process, analytic process, get to a point where, yes, there's nothing that intrinsically exists. To the point where you have to make sure, but there's no such thing as a but. So it's really a complete deconstructive approach. And then when you get to the final conclusion stage, just reflect and stay there, and so that it becomes reinforced. But the process itself is primarily discursive. So he's asking us to go through it again and again and again and again, but stop, reflect, strengthen it, reinforce, but then go again. And he says that's for the beginners, because he doesn't expect us to have the sort of stability of mind that you can sustain it for a long time. On the second stage, which is where, those of us who have been meditating for many years, hopefully we should be on the second stage, not the first stage. There, he's really talking about this balance of discursive and resting. And pure discursivity is not going to work, but pure resting practice is not going to work. And there, what he wants to do is he wants us to really maintain a fine balance between the strength and of the ascertainment of emptiness, our understanding in plain English, and the stability of the mind. Because when you apply too much discursivity, the stability will get undermined. Your mind becomes too busy. But if you become too stable, then the force of the ascertainment, the understanding, the awareness of emptiness will get diminished. That's a natural, law of psychology. So what he wants to do is he wants us to really practice ourselves so that we are able to maintain this fine balance, so that as we emphasize the stability, and once we begin to recognize that the force of the understanding is getting diminished, we reinforce by engaging into discursive practice. Once you have get to a certain level of strong analysis and understanding, then don't overdo it, because otherwise it will destroy the stability. And in this way, he says we need to maintain. And any session where we can do this, and his suggestion is at the beginning to keep the sessions short, but have many sessions. I hope that once the pandemic situation is over, some of the Gelug centers will really, put these into practice, have retreat sessions where you go through this guide to the view, maybe a week by week, and hopefully you can have geshes and lamas who can guide you through. Because these practices, the guide to the view texts are quite short, and they can be used as a kind of a manual, but it would presuppose some understanding before. And in this way, what Tsongkhapa is saying is that, this is how the mind, but basically what he's saying is that we are trying to change the fundamental habits of the mind. And the fundamental habits of the mind cannot be changed simply by stopping thinking. Because, his point is that we are learning to view reality in a different way. And that relearning requires actually an active cultivation of wisdom. So those are really crucial parts of Tsongkhapa's teaching. And I think it's helpful if, as we remember him and as we feel grateful to his teachings, as much as possible, we can also engage with some of his teachings in a more specific and personal way. And Guide to the View, Datri, are really beautiful set of teachings. The Library of Tibetan Classics volume on Gelug tradition is going to be, right now I'm in the middle of finalizing the editing. We will probably have it released next year or maybe early 2022. And it contains a set of Guide to the View teachings, one by Yongzi Shigyaltsen. And Guide to the View Tati is actually an important genre in many of the Gelug masters, right? And Gyaltsab. So there are many, depending on whoever is going to be your teacher, can choose one and then take you through these instructions. So I thought, so I'm using the 18-line teaching as a kind of a springboard to basically talk more about, how to make the understanding of emptiness, the meditation of emptiness, actually real in our own day-to-day life. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we can have some Q&A. Sorry, I spoke longer than I was planning to, but.
No, we're deeply grateful for that extra length. And so we're really, and also the hard advice that's there for all of us. I did put links to the books that the one book in particular, the Gombo Rapso, which will be coming out in March. So there are pre-order links. I put those in the comment section. So let's open it up to questions. If you have any questions, raise your hand, unmute yourself, send a message in the chat. But we'd love to have your questions. In the spirit of Lama Tsongkhapa, that's probably what we should be doing, as Jinpa said so kindly, again and again and again. So I see Venerable Amy Miller has a question. No? Okay.
I think Yuvini has her hand up. Yuvini?
All right, Yuvini.
Thank you so much, Jinpa. It's so nice to see you.
Same here.
Very, very precious teaching. And my question is, I love that you spoke about the more subtle method of meditating on impermanence. I find that actually his second one, where you look at the subject, is easier because you can look at the mind and then nothing there. But when I look at, like a cup, the reification is so strong that I have to use very gross levels to think about impermanence. So I would love some ideas on how to maybe meditate on that with those subtle techniques, if you could extrapolate. Thank you.
I think for the external, the reason why he's leaving the subject before the object is that generally the tendency is, when we deconstruct the object, our tendency is to spring to more subject. So that's the idea. And this is something that you also see in the philosophical traditions as well. So the mind only is a move away from deconstructing the external objects, that you tend to move on mind. And historically in India, say for example, if you look at Vedanta tradition, Advaita, Advaita, envisions the final reality to be some kind of indivisible union of, mind, consciousness, and reality, which is what the great Brahman is eternal. So there is a tendency of the human mind to sort of move from object to subject. So that's why he left. For the object, I think instead of choosing a specific object like a cup, probably the more effective approach first is to look at the universal principle itself. So that's why if you look at the Buddhist teaching on impermanence, particularly in the Indian Mahayana tradition, so there is this, you have the four characteristics of the First Noble Truth. You have the impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and then no self. So impermanence there is really focused more from the perspective of the causal dynamic, how the events and things are all in some sense at the mercy of the causes and conditions. So that kind of, and the fact that when things are produced by their causes, that the seed for their eventual annihilation is already built in them as part of almost like a kind of a self-destruct key. So the universal teaching on emptiness really has this very, very radical idea that although when we think about the world, we think of growth, we think of expansion, but actually, if you understand deeper, everything has built in it. So this is the entropy principle in some ways. There's a similar idea in Buddhism. I think looking at that is probably the first step, just very broad. And then you can take more specific examples. And because otherwise, if you take at this, it's very difficult to move beyond the fact that it's tangible, it's there, I can turn my eyes away and then I can look at it and it's still there kind of thing, So that's probably, at least that's how I do it, so.
Thank you so much, very helpful.
We have a question from Venerable Tenzin Lexo, who's joining us from India.
Thank you for staying up so late. It must be very late there. You're muted.
Yes, Lexok, if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah.
It's very worthwhile staying up. Thank you so much. I really liked your description of the importance of the psychological aspect of meditating on emptiness. And I was just wondering, because you've read so many texts on emptiness, where have you found the clearest and kind of most extensive description of the object of negation? Could you give some advice that way?
That's a good question, actually. Tsongkhapa's own Gompa Rapsel has a section on object of negation, both according to Svatrantika and Prasangika. So that's one important section. And then, unfortunately, there are not that many translations, but Panchen Lobsang Chögyен is probably, for me, one of the most compelling teachers in the Gelug tradition. He was very practice-oriented. He also has a beautiful way of putting things in very plain Tibetan, if I can use that word, plain English kind of equivalent. And so Panchen Lobsang Chögyen has, for example, he has this a beautiful text called Debate Between the Grasping Mind and the Wisdom of Emptiness. It's a sort of a mock-up debate. There's, in fact, an English translation of it. I haven't seen it myself, but by Ken.
There too.
Yeah, what's his name? Ken
Lieberman. Ken Lieberman.
Yeah, Ken Lieberman.
And Venerable Feder also. There are two translations.
Oh, okay. So that is one text that has, because, Tsongkhapa is spread, although there is a section in Gompa Rapsel, but you really have to tease it out from specific sections where he's bringing it up. And some of the subtler ones are in the Tatri Guide to the View text. There's one called Guide to the View according to the unique understanding of Prasangika. This is a Tatri that was scribed by Kirubje, based on teachings by Tsongkhapa. And there, it's a short text, but there, the Gajang Ebene, the first essential point, or the first key point, there's quite a detailed section on the need to pay more attention to the appearing aspect, the Nawa, Nangtsul versus Shentsul. So in many subsequent Gelug Yikchas, a lot of emphasis on the Shentsu, how the grasping mind grasps. But in Tsongkhapa's own text, actually there seems to be greater emphasis on spending a lot of time on understanding how the mind fundamentally perceives, not apprehends, how the mind fundamentally perceives. So this is Nangtsul. So the word Nawa is a tricky one because the Tibetan word Nawa has both subjective and objective, dimensions. When an object appears to you, we use the word Nawa, but also when Shebala Nawa, it's better translated as when the mind perceives. So he's talking really about the way in which our mind naturally perceives things, and then may apprehend it. So this Nangzul, and he really, and for me that is really helpful. And then the other thing is in Gompa Rapsel, there are sections where he talks about how until we get to a certain stage in our realization of emptiness, it's very difficult, almost impossible for us to differentiate between whether we are perceiving thing in itself or whether we are perceiving things in an intrinsic way. He says that conceptually, it's almost impossible to differentiate because our attribution of intrinsic existence is so automatic, so spontaneous, so subconscious, that it's only much later that we can begin to tease out. So those are things that you have to bring together to really get a clear sense of this culture. And then in Gompa Rapsel, towards the sort of second part, there is three arguments from entering the middle way against the concept of intrinsic arising, and then one extra one from the auto-commentary of Chandrakirti. So you have to really combine all of these. So I've tried to write quite a lengthy intro to my Gompa Rapsel translation to try to sort of put these together so that in a way kind of it'll be easier for for the modern reader to be able to sort of appreciate their significance. So I wrote quite a lengthy intro essay as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venerable Leksok. We're going to stay in that part of the world. Venerable Gyalten Lekton has a question.
Oh, Tashi Genla, thank you so much for the talk. If I heard you correctly, I thought you said that Tsongkhapa says there's a strong emphasis on the Nawa, right? The Nansul of intrinsic existence. However, since intrinsic existence doesn't exist, do you mean then by means of understanding the Gakya, that's how you have a Nansul of intrinsic existence?
Yeah.
Or is it in meditation, you say Gelte di yuna di drabo yang ye, and then you negate that?
Well, I think he's basically asking, because we attribute intrinsic existence to things naturally anyway.
Yeah.
So he's really saying that we need to do some psychological work first to be able to recognize how we're doing it. And this, at the level of apprehension is in some ways for him, it's easier. What is more challenging is at the level of very perception itself, Nawa, at the Nawa level. So he's, in the Tatri text at least, it doesn't come out very explicit in the major treatises, but in the Tatri text, this point comes out. And it's picked up by Benjamin Shugen and Yongzi Shi Gyalten, and so the subsequent teachers also pick up on this. But the point is that for Gagja Ngebe Lo, so the first Gagja Nangsul is where a lot of the energy should be spent. So here, that's one of the reasons why I'm saying that in his teaching on emptiness, he's bringing a very strong psychological dimension as well. Yeah.
I see. So when you say the appearance of the intrinsic existence, you mean by means of the appearance of the Gakya, of the object to negate it?
Yes.
Okay.
But when we say appearance, we tend to think it's coming from the other side.
That's why perception maybe.
Yeah, that's why I prefer the word.
Nawa is easier.
Yeah, exactly. I prefer that language because then you don't have something appearing to the mind,
Lassa. Touche. Thank you.
We're going to go to Lynn O'Connor. Lynn O'Connor has a question. And Lynn, we'll need you to unmute yourself. There you go. You're good.
Thank you for that wonderful teaching. So I know we met in Telluride, and I had the same question then, but I'm going to ask it again. From the point of view of Lama Tsongkhapa, as a psychologist, I understand that the unconscious mind is adaptive. That's how we survived as a species. And pro-social or altruistic, that's how we survive as a social species through the forces of evolution. So my question is, does this relate, or would Lama Tsongkhapa see this as related to our Buddha nature?
The fact that we are capable of compassion, we're capable of altruism, would be seen as an expression of a Buddha nature. There is a beautiful line in Maitreya's Uttara Tantra, where one of the arguments for the presence of Buddha nature is that we naturally aspire for happiness. We naturally shun suffering. So this drive, this aspiration is very fundamental. So the seed potential for attainment of Buddhahood must be there naturally in all beings. So that's Tsongkhapa would agree. But where Tsongkhapa is different from other Tibetan teachers is that he wouldn't want to reify Buddha nature as something that is highly elevated, as a one thing. Because again, he's in that spirit, he's very Nagarjunian. He's very true to Nagarjuna's spirit of never coming up with positive attributes to ultimate reality. So in other traditions, in other Tibetan traditions, sometimes Buddha nature is really elevated. It's almost like a union of emptiness and the gnosis, yishe, jhana, and it's eternal. It's positive. Tsongkhapa, Buddha nature, the nature is understood in Tsongkhapa in the form of a potential. So sentient beings possess Buddha nature because sentient beings have the potential to become Buddha. And then if you go more specific, what exactly is that nature, then he would identify three separate things. The emptiness of the unenlightened mind is Buddha nature. The potential for Buddhahood is Buddha nature. And also the fact that the sentient beings are receptive to Buddha's enlightened activity is also Buddha nature. So, and this is tied to the specific passages in Maitreya's text itself. And so he doesn't see Nyingpo Chen, Tathagata Garba, as one thing. So this is where Tsongkhapa is quite different from other traditions.
Wonderful. We have, do we have time for maybe two questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions, yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you. So we're going to go to Min.
Hello, I have a question. Basically, Jinpa, I have a question. So essentially,
Yes.
What does the mind of a Buddha realizing emptiness feels like? Basically, can we put someone who realized emptiness into a machine and then scan the mind?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, there's a whole discussion in the Tibetan tradition on Buddha's with gnosis. And there has been also a debate on whether or not it makes sense to actually attribute something like mind in the Buddhahood. And there were some Tibetan teachers who actually went to the extent of saying nothing exists in Buddhahood. There is no wisdom, only in metaphoric sense. Tsongkhapa doesn't go that far. Tsongkhapa actually wants to maintain that the Buddha is omniscient, knows both the conventional reality and the ultimate reality. And there is such a thing as Buddha's wisdom realizing emptiness. Now, when it comes to describing, then it gets very complicated. But my sense is, I've been with His Holiness for a long time, and I've had the privilege to see His Holiness's personal notes on his experience of emptiness when he spent an extended period of time in the sort of early 60s, mid 60s until late 60s in Dharamsala, and some of those sort of journal entries are pretty powerful. So and I can get a sense what it must feel like, but from description of Tsongkhapa's own experience too, we could sort of at least have a guess of what it must feel like. I think there is clearly a sense of freedom. There is no need to grasp. There is a sort of a freedom in the sense of, being at ease with reality without having to bring anything extra. And also, I think the qualities of the mind, like compassion and altruism, has no hindrance. They express it without any obstacles. Whereas for us ordinary people, despite all our best intentions, we are very complex, and we have many other sets of motivation systems. So in any given moment, even though we may wish to bring the best of ourselves, we end up bringing some other part of us. So in someone who is realized emptiness, I think a lot of these become way simpler. That's my sense. There's a kind of a total freedom, and I would also suggest joy, and because you're much closer to reality, and you don't have to put on this whole psychological edifice to guard yourself, to protect yourself, because a lot of our reification has to do with want, to seek a haven of security. So yeah, I would say freedom and joy and spontaneity are probably the most important aspects of those experiences. Yeah. But maybe in 10 years' time, I'll be able to say a bit more. Let's see.
Thank you so much. Our final question, we're going to go to Sujata Baliga. Sujata?
Hi, my internet connection is weak, so I'm sorry if I break up. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful teaching and talk. So beneficial. My question is around meditative practice in deconstructing the I. And when, I go through more of the grosser physical elements, even the consciousnesses, the skandhas, that seems like I can touch a little bit on my cursory understanding of dependent origination. But when it comes to the mind itself, it is, I can get to the parts analysis, right? Like the rosary sense of it. But then I end up with reification of the rosary, right? I think I really want, and so it may just be beyond, sort of this intellectual understanding to stop there and try to do dependent origination of the mind itself. But that is utterly elusive to me. So if there's some specific text that you would suggest or some practice guide here on the specifics of the dependent origination of the mind, maybe to help cut my reification of the rosary, that would be great.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you. I'm impressed. I think one thing that would be helpful is using the temporal analysis perspective, because as you say, the rosary is the individual mind movements strung together, and individual mind movements strung together presupposes temporality, and temporality requires presupposition of at least three aspects of the time. But when you come to it, it's very difficult to actually differentiate, because whatever is present is always going to have a little leftover from the past and some aspects of anticipation of the future. So when you dig that deeper, I think you can do better than rosary there, because rosary is individual beads which are strung on a string, but there is no overlap. Whereas when you use temporal approach, then there is an overlap, and this overlap allows you to analyze in a slightly deeper way. At least that's what I find more helpful. So this overlap, and then and instead of thinking, because when you think of mind movements as individual beads, once you deconstruct each of the beads, then you don't know what to do. Okay, whereas if you look at not so much as individual beats, but as a continuous string of mind movements with in temporal sense of each moment having a little bit of past and bit of future, and then analyzing in those ways, you can go still deeper. But I think at some point, you probably need to do a bit more shamatha type practice. Yeah. And then maybe a kind of a Geluk Mahamudra type or Kagyu Mahamudra type of just, staying with the luminosity. Just this idea of mind as a clear clarity, is simple awareness. And Panchen Lobsang Chogyam's text has a beautiful section on this. In Kagyu Mahamudra also it's quite strong, but in Panchen he combines it with emptiness. So he uses that meditation as part of the shamatha, and then he moves on to the vipassana, the analysis later. So it gives you a much more sort of more shamatha type approach to bringing up the nature of mind. So I think if you combine, but for your right now, if you're doing deconstruction, in addition to the strings, which is what Shantideva advises us in Buddhacharya Avatara, because he says that the gyun, the continuity, is like a mala, But I think if you use the temporal perspective approach as well, and then move on to Panchen Lama's Mahamudra sort of, and it's going to come out next year. So end of next year, probably the Gelug volume will be out. And I'm a big fan of Panchen Lobsang Chogyam. After Tsongkhapa, for me, it's really Panchen Lobsang Chogyam that I'm very close to. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So helpful.
Yes, we thank you for going over a little bit of time due to our late start, Jinpa. So we just want to a quick wrap up notes. There are links to the Compassion Institute, which is a major initiative that Thupten Jinpa is behind out of that's here in the Bay Area. I've put those links. I've shared the links to the pre-order for the new text that will be coming out in March. That Jinpa mentioned as well, and we do look forward to the other volume of the Ear Whispered, the Geluk Ear Whispered lineage. So we're very grateful for that. We just really want to express our thanks for the hard advice and encouragement that you've given to us. We know your time is precious, so thank you so much for sharing this and nurturing our enthusiasm for. As a center, we've tried to do our very small part to also share the importance and the uniqueness of Tsongkhapa's thought and his example as a scholar, a practitioner, and a yogi. So thank you so much for inspiring us to continue that. And we want to wish you and your families safety. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for really, offering me this opportunity. And I would like to thank all of you for being such enthusiasts for Jey Tsongkhapa. I've personally been, of course, as a former Ganden monk, and every time I read Tsongkhapa's Lamun Chemo or Gompa Rapsel, even though I've taught Gompa Rapsel myself several times, but every time I read it again, specific sections, I feel I'm learning new. So his writings are one of those great master's writings where it looks like every time you yourself grow, there's a new understanding that comes to be, opening up. So I feel very happy and privileged to have this opportunity to share with you my own personal enthusiasm, and as much as possible, I try to emulate the example that Tsongkhapa has set. And in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about Kidrup Sundel, so being a scholar and as well as a practitioner or Siddha. So the Siddha part is a tricky one. The scholar part, at least, I can emulate. So I try to sort of live that life. Thank you.
And along those lines, I'm just putting up two books. The one from which the 18 lines were extracted from, Tsongkhapa, Buddha in the Land of Snows, published by Shambhala. And for those who want a deeper dive, we really highly recommend Self-Reality and Reason in Tibetan Philosophy to really go for a bit of a deeper dive into the analysis of Tsongkhapa's quest for the middle way, a bit of which we learned about today. Just a quick mention too that we've had people joining us on Facebook from Uruguay, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, Bhutan, And we just want to thank all of them for being here too. So thank you very much, Jinpa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jinpa. Please consider returning to Thupten Lane.
Thank you. Yeah, the Zoom learning is quite easy. So
thank you again.
bye-bye. Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.